Welcome, everyone, to our South by Southwest panel, Introspection and Empathy, Building a Kinder Future. I am Lori Santos. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University, and I'm host of the Happiness Lab podcast. And now I want to pivot to our other panelists so they can introduce themselves. Jamil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Lori. I'm Jamil Zaki. I'm a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the author of the book, The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World.
I'm Ethan Kross. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan and the author of the book Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters and How to Harness It.
And so today we're talking about empathy and introspection, which I think are two topics that have become incredibly salient during this strange period where we're living during COVID-19, right? I mean, I think if you engineered a crisis to mess up our social connection, it would be this global pandemic we're all going through right now. And so, Jamil, why don't you start us off by talking about what is happening to our social connection during this crisis? Why has this gotten so bad?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think there's a stereotype that we have about terrible times and disasters, which is that they tear us apart. And then that when the rules go away and the lights go off, we all sort of focus only on ourselves. In fact, the historical record suggests it's the opposite. When disasters strike, whether they're earthquakes or tsunamis or wars, people actually come together. They want to be comforted by each other and they want to help one another. But I think one of the most pernicious features of COVID-19 is that the threat isn't a tsunami or a bomb. The threat is our friends, our extended family, our neighbors, our colleagues, and that it sort of drives us apart at the very moment that we're stressed and need each other more than ever. And in fact, I would say that the phrase social distancing was a huge mistake. Now, I'm not saying that it's a mistake to be apart physically, that's important for public health, but to call it social distancing suggests to people that their job right now is to be lonely, is to cut off their ties. And I think that's one surefire way to get people kind of stuck in their head. Ethan, I know you've thought a lot about how that might affect sort of the conversations we have with ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's a paradox here because we're now spending all of this time alone. And we know that when we are alone, and in particular, when we're experiencing negative emotions, we tend to focus inward to try to make sense of those problems, to work through them and feel better. But we often get stuck. We end up spinning, we get anxious, we catastrophize, we ruminate, which I think it's safe to say a lot of people are doing right now. We on this call have probably had our moments doing that ourselves at times. And there's one really negative and almost paradoxical consequence associated with getting stuck in our heads with respect to this pandemic, which is it can actually serve to distance us even further from our social relationships, because we know that when people are anxious and ruminating, that can create friction in our relationships because we seek out help from others. We talk about our problems and we keep talking about them. We keep talking about them. We don't always listen, and that can push other people away. And so we have many forces working against the establishment of empathy right now, which I think is a major issue that we need to figure out how to solve. And, throw it back to you, Jamil. I know empathy is your baby. This is what you live and breathe. So, in your work, how have you managed to bridge this gap when you have people who need something, which is other people here, but they're self-sabotaging because of their own chatter going on in their head from really connecting with those groups?
Yeah, I think, Ethan, one of the first things, as you know, that I try to do and that all of us try to do in helping people construct a better future, a better path forward, is to understand the errors that we're making and why we're making them. Because I think they're not our fault. They don't make us bad people, but there are a lot of these unforced errors in our psychological lives. And one of them, even as you're saying, is what happens to us when we're under stress, when our chatter starts to overwhelm us with self-talk, because that type of stress can drive us inward. It can make me feel like, well, shoot, I'm doing Zoom school with my kids. I'm working from home. My Wi-Fi is out now, so everything's a disaster. I've got to just focus on me. And it feels like the last thing in the world that I have time for, energy for, bandwidth for, is to show up for other people. But one of the things that evidence across decades of psychology now demonstrates is that when we show up for other people, we help ourselves. And in fact, one of the most efficient ways that we can become happier is by being there for others, by empathizing with them, and by helping them. So I think there's a really, there's a second sad irony of the pandemic, is that when it makes us focus only on ourselves and not help others, of course, that deprives others of an opportunity to receive our help, but it also deprives us of one of the things that would be most useful to build our happiness, which is drawing and maintaining and strengthening those social connections. I know, Laura, you talk a lot about the different ways that our mind plays tricks on us. And we've talked about that as one particular way. And I'm sure there are other ways during the pandemic that you've seen sort of people engaging in these unforced errors.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is one of the big problems that's contributing to all our mental health problems right now. I think all of us know that we need to protect our mental health in addition to our physical health right now. And we have these strategies for physical health, right? You wear your masks and, physically distance, as Jamil would sort of put it, right? But I think we don't really know necessarily what to do to protect our mental health. We have some theories, but as you're pointing out, the problem is that those theories are wrong. We think, oh, I'm so stressed, I'm burnt out from remote learning and dealing with my kids at home or whatever. I'm going to just go inward and not hang out with anyone and not reach out, right? I'm going to pay attention to what I need and my own needs, right? I'm going to stick inside my head and just kind of watch that chatter go on, right? We have these ideas about what's going to work, but those ideas, the research suggests is wrong. And so this is one of the reasons we wanted to do this panel, is to give us some ideas about what really will work and what are ways we can harness, our own natural psychological resources to do a little bit better right now. And so, Ethan, I wanted to pivot back to you. You looked really carefully at ways that we can harness our chatter for good, right? Kind of overcome some of the problems with the chatter that we're all facing right now. Any advice for the folks listening about how they can do that?
Yeah, so there's a silver lining to this story that I think we easily forget when we become so consumed with our problems, which is there are a lot of science-based tools that exist. We've learned a lot about how to break out of this funk. So we cannot be so consumed with our own problems and instead connect with others. And, one of the things we know is that when we experience chatter, worry, rumination, we tend to zoom in, tunnel vision on the problem at hand, to the exclusion of everything and everyone else in our lives. And so there's a natural antidote to that, which is to zoom out, to look at the bigger picture. So how do you do that? Well, there are lots of ways to do it. One of my favorites is something called temporal distancing or mental time travel. So I will frequently think about, all right, how am I going to feel once this pandemic ends 9 months, 12 months from now, when I'm able to see the two of you at a conference and we can go out to dinner and actually have a conversation in person. When I engage in that slight shift, what that does is it makes it clear that what I'm going through right now, as awful as it is, and look, it's pretty awful, it's temporary. It will pass. And that broadens my perspective in ways that's really powerful. I also go back in time, right? I think about the pandemic of 1918. That was arguably even worse than what we're going through right now. Again, not to trivialize what's happening now, but we didn't have Zoom back then. We didn't have takeout, right? We have a lot of things that are making this a lot easier. And so those are ways of broadening us. And we know that when people broaden their perspective, that doesn't just have implications for the self, making us feel better. It has implications for how we engage with others. It makes us more open to other people's perspectives. It makes us wiser, which I think we've been lacking to some extent over the past year when we've been stuck in this pandemic. So those are just a few things that we can do. Jamil, what about on your end? You want to jump in there?
What you're saying is actually, I'd love to talk a little bit about self-compassion and see, because what you're saying is sort of making me think about a connection I hadn't really put together before. So let me pitch you on it, and I'd love to hear from both of you what you think about it. So, in the study of empathy, we often say, it has to start at home, that it's very difficult to connect with others and be there for others if you can't be there for yourself. But sometimes that's actually the hardest thing to do, right? So we see our friends going through hardships. We see them mess up in some way. We see them fail. And we're so forgiving of them. We think, well, that's not you. That's just your circumstance, and you're going to get past this. We make the same errors and we beat ourselves up, I don't know, for years. Maybe I'm just telling on myself right now. But one of the core features of self-compassion is to not turn away from our suffering, but to see it. And I think, Ethan, this is the connection I'm trying to draw from a broader lens, which is to understand that suffering is one thing that we all have in common. And I think during the pandemic, many of us have been suffering alone, but in very similar ways. And I don't want to equate different people's experience exactly. And we'll talk more about that later, I hope. But, you know, your colleagues, your friends, your family are going through this unprecedented time and experiencing it. And some of the contours of those experiences are similar. And the idea is when you reflect on suffering as something that doesn't separate you from other people, but actually brings you together with them and sort of is a human universal, that's a way to attain wisdom and to cope with our own problems. I'd love to hear, Ethan, from you, if that sounds relevant to this sort of distancing that you're describing.
Yeah, I think that's one critical piece to this puzzle, which is there's great power that comes with what I'd call normalization, knowing that what I'm experiencing right now, I'm not alone in that experience and that I share that with other people. There's a common suffering that we're all engaged in. When we have that understanding, we know that that brings us closer to one another. It makes us feel more connected. It establishes what I think you'd probably agree is an empathic connection, which we know is critically important. There is one other step, though, that I think is important, which is this. It's easy when we're connecting with others over our common suffering, it's easy to just get stuck talking about the suffering and co-ruminating about it, which is great for establishing empathy. But we also have to take that a step further, which is trying to help one another shift our perspective on the problem too. So that's not only the empathic connection, but we're also changing the way we think about the situation now so that it's not as aversive. And I think it's those two elements that's really important for how we can help one another through this mess. And so, you know, there are people in my life that I call who are really good at helping me do exactly this. They give me empathy and they help broaden our perspective. One of those people is on this Zoom call right now. It's you, Dr. Zaki. You're great at doing this. And I write about this in my book, Chatter. You are the ultimate chatter advisor. So there's an artistry to this. I think it's about establishing a connection, but then also helping us shift perspective. And I think that's the two-step process to getting through this together. Lori, can I ask you a question? Because you're in a unique situation where you not only are bathed in the science of happiness quite a bit through a lot of the outreach that you do, but you also are immersed with undergraduates because you live with them. And maybe you tell people a little bit about what that's like. It's not salacious, as Lori will tell you, but you have ample opportunity, I think, more than most of us, to see what is working for students and what's not. What's your take on how these processes play out in that group?
Yeah. Well, thanks for setting up my role in the most sort of creepy, salacious way possible.
It did come across the wrong way. I apologize.
No, totally good. No, so I'm a head of college on Yale's campus, which means I'm one of the faculty who live with students, which was already enlightening for all these processes about empathy and chatter and all these things, but has gotten so much more interesting in the context of COVID-19, right? Where we're literally running a college campus that's whole purpose is to socially connect students and allow them to interact and empathically learn from each other's perspectives, mostly over Zoom. And it's just been, really, really strange. But, I think seeing these college students in person, like you get to see exactly the kinds of things that we're talking about here. First, the importance of social compassion is first, the importance of self-compassion, rather, as Jamil's talking about it, right? This idea that you just kind of need to give yourself some grace sometimes, right? It's hard to be living through a pandemic. It's harder to live through a pandemic if you're 19 years old and you're taking Zoom classes. But often we just don't give ourselves that grace, ultimately because we often have these wrong theories about what's going on, right? We think giving ourselves grace is kind of weak or sort of admitting failure or making us less than the other folks who are kind of miraculously getting through the pandemic fine. And this is another spot where our minds lie to us, right? If you look at the research, this act of giving yourself a little bit of compassion, recognizing that this is part of your common humanity, it actually makes you better at getting through crises. It makes you more resilient at getting through crises. Work by Kristen Neff, who's at UT Austin, who we'd probably be getting drinks with if we were actually at South by Southwest and not over Zoom. She finds that you're better able to get through challenging times. You're less likely to procrastinate when tough things come up. And so, this idea of giving yourself some grace, which can be hard in general, especially hard for my type A, Ivy League students, it's exactly the path we need to connect with other people, but also to give ourselves a little bit of the bandwidth that we need to kind of get through this crisis. Jamil, I know you've talked a lot about this idea of empathy and self-compassion. I mean, is this the kind of thing that you're seeing when you talk to your students too?
Oh, absolutely. One of the reasons that I started studying self-compassion was because it was so hard for my students. I teach a little seminar at Stanford called Becoming Kinder that has these different kindness exercises in it. And some of them are really challenging, like connect with someone you disagree with, or, sort of volunteer on a regular basis, like things that take a lot of time and energy. And the first time I taught it, the last kindness challenge was called reversing the golden rule, which was simply treating yourself the way that you would treat another person who you love. And students just had a really hard time with it because they've told themselves the exact story, Lori, that you're referring to, which is that, the way that we succeed is by being hard on ourselves, by not cutting ourselves any slack. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for just pushing myself every moment. And it turns out that that might be a short-term solution for success, but it's a surefire way to burn out eventually and to not really cope with difficult times very well. So yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly one of the most critical things to focus on during hard times, including these.
It's, if I could just jump in for a second, what's so interesting about that exercise, reversing the golden rule, treating yourself like others, is one of the tools that we find is often really helpful for breaking people out of their immersed chatter funk is actually doing a strange linguistic hack, if you will, actually working themselves through a problem using their own name, right? So, and what's interesting here is this is a way of people using language to think about themselves like they were someone else. So most of the time that we use names when we think about and refer to other people. And so the idea is that when you use those parts of speech to think about yourself, it's like a psychological jujitsu move, right? It's effortlessly shifting your perspective. It's, okay, Ethan, what are we going to do here? And so one question is, and we know that helps people deal with chatter, whether that also promotes self-compassion, I think is a really interesting question to think about too. Does it make it easier to give ourselves a break when we use our name? I suspect it would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so part of giving ourselves a break might be trying to, in this panel, kind of take a new perspective on the pandemic. We've been talking about a lot of the problems of social connection, but, one of the things I see in my work is that if you really want to promote mental health, you need to take an attitude of gratitude, as cheesy as it sounds, right? You need to count your blessings. And one of the reasons I was excited to talk to both of you is I was really interested in your unique perspectives on sort of what are some of the upsides of this crisis for empathy and kind of connecting, and maybe even the chatter inside our heads. What do you predict that we might want to take with us at the end of this crisis, right? It's kind of a strange, it's a crisis and it's an awful pandemic, but it's kind of short term, right? Where with the vaccines and things, we're sort of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Like, Jamil, are there any things you think we should be taking with us as we kind of get through the other side of COVID?
Oh, yeah. And I think that the temptation will be to not take anything with us because we're going to want to just forget this time and go back to restaurants and go back to conferences and do all the things that we did before and just block it out. But oftentimes, the worst moments bring out the best in us and they teach us a lot if we're willing to listen, right? I'm not saying that we're glad to have gone through them, but we can gain a lot if we pay attention. And I think that one way that happens is that adversity shines a light on what mattered to us all along and also helps us see maybe ways that our old normal wasn't that normal to begin with, right? I mean, so a lot of us now really understand the need that we have for social connection, but we were losing that bit by bit and becoming lonelier and lonelier each year prior to the pandemic. I think that the pandemic, although that it's created some common suffering, as we were talking about earlier, it's also highlighted incredible disparities across our culture when it comes to race, class, socioeconomic status, gender, you name it. And I think that looking at that mirror, really taking a good look at it, can help us build more compassionate and equitable practices in our lives, in our businesses and workplaces, and ultimately in our culture. But I think, one thing I'd love to throw it back to you here, Lori, is there's something that I really love about your podcast is that you focus on, and you focus your listeners on, the idea that becoming happier isn't about some big swing that you take, some grandiose gesture, like, spending 6 months in Nepal or donating 80% of your income to charity. it comes from those little habits of mind that we engage in. And, I think that to me, one of the ways that we can move out of this crisis into a better normal is to focus on little practices that we can engage in, like, not just once, but pretty much all the time, that might help us recuperate some of the things that we've lost or bolster some of the things that we were lacking before. Do you have a top, and like a top 2 or 3 like habits of mind that you think will be critical for people coming out of this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you've mentioned some of them already, right? Like social connection in real life, this thing that we're missing so much during this time of physical distancing. Like, we need more of that. And my hope is that we're actually going to come out of this craving that. I've seen that a little bit even in my college students, right? One of the things I was so sad about before this crisis is how often my college students would kind of forego in real life social connection to be online. I've talked about, before the pandemic, seeing all my students in the dining hall with these big headphones on, and they're just like looking at their phones, and I'm like, there are other humans you could connect with here, right? But the funny thing is, like, I think the pandemic has changed that. I think everybody is so sick of being on Zoom and Zoom fatigue that at the end of the day of like a college student remote learning, like, you don't want to like watch more things on the screen. You want to connect to any human in real life that you can really talk to. And my students self-report that there's more like till 4 a.m. conversations, that weren't happening before because people were like playing video games or on Netflix. There's more like very intentional like moments where they're trying to connect outside of it, like scheduling walks with friends that, again, they just didn't do before the pandemic. And so I think as we get through this crisis and we realize how valuable social connection was before, I'm hopeful we'll be able to put it in more. And this is, one of the easiest happiness tips is just to be around other people and kind of engage with them. But a different happiness tip, I think I'll pivot over to Ethan on this, is just like recognizing that you can regulate and control your own behavior and your own thoughts. And so Ethan, I'd love you to kind of give some of your habits of mind that come from the work on the chatter in your head that our folks listening could end up using to regulate their behavior moving out of this pandemic.
Yeah, I'm happy to. But before I go into it, I feel compelled now, given what you just talked about with the Zoom fatigue, to apologize to viewers for fatiguing you more with some Zoom. But we're really happy you came to listen.
1.5 speed.
1.5 speed. We will pick it up. So, I think this has been an amazing, in some ways. Here's the positive spin on the past 11 months, right? Which is, we've had an opportunity to figure out what are the tools that help us when we have chatter, when we're worried, when we're ruminating, like what actually makes us feel better. And I don't think there's any magic bullet. We've actually been doing research on how people are regulating themselves during the pandemic. And what we find is that there are combinations of tools that work for people, and different tools work for different people. So for me, mental time travel, taking walks in green spaces, connecting with people in my life who provide me with empathy but broaden my perspective, spending time with my kids. That's the magic formula for me that has really kept me happy, relatively speaking, during this time. And I think people out there have had the opportunity to self-experiment to figure out the specific tools that work for them. And that's information that they can take with them after the pandemic ends, because there's no question there are going to be other opportunities to regulate chatter. It's a fact of life. Like, there are going to be times that leave us stressed. The one thing that I hope, though, is that we don't quickly turn back to normal. And what I mean by that is this: we are all craving normalcy right now. And the good news is, I think we're going to get it in maybe 9 or 12 months, right? Once the vaccines are rolled out. But we know it's very easy for us to slip into the old way of being. It's very easy for us to forget about the pain we endured. Like, I experienced very painful moments in my life when my kids were young babies and put me through sleep deprivation. I've totally forgotten about it. I just think about the positive moments now. So this is a feature of the human mind. We very quickly adapt. And I think there's a risk there if we forget about the kinds of things that we've been talking about here, the importance of social connection and what happens when it's missing. So I hope we can remember some of that as we move forward. I didn't kick it back to anyone else there. That was the drop the mic moment. We're done. So I mean, Lori, Jamil, anything else to add about, we do have some more time until we get through this pandemic. Any other things people should be mindful of?
Lori, please.
I mean, I think, this idea that I've really tried to focus on that has been so helpful for me trying to get through this pandemic is really just remembering how much control we really have, right? Like, even in this time of physical distancing, I can call a friend. Even in this time of physical distancing, I can try to, make some arrangements to meet with somebody socially distanced, or really try to connect with somebody in real life. My husband that I live with, like try to find like real time that I can connect with him. Like, these are choices that we have control over and that we can make. And then a second thing we have control over is our mindset, right? We can sort of try to see this time of the pandemic as this awful, woe is me sort of situation, or we can sort of reframe it as a challenge, as a time to sort of form these new habits of mind and use them even better. And so for me, those two, that big like insight, like, wait a minute, even though this all feels so out of control, I have so much control over what I can do, both in terms of my empathy and in terms of my mindset. That's really been a game changer for me. And I hope that sticks with me, because again, the pandemic's going to end, but as you said, Ethan, like the stresses of life, they're going to be back, right? I'm going to need to recognize that I have control in all those other domains too. So that's been the big game changer for me. Jamil?
Yeah, I think really sort of resonating with what both of you are saying, something that matters a lot to me is not forgetting this time. Because, as you're saying, Ethan, I slightly remember the sleep deprivation of my kids' early days as well, but have somewhat blocked it out. And yet, those are some of those important times of my life that also gave me a lot of direction in what I'm doing now. This is different. It's a globally negative thing. A globally negative experience, but I still think, as we've been talking about, it has so many lessons for the future. So how do we not forget those lessons? Well, one thing that I've been doing that it started pre-pandemic, but I'm very happy to be doing it now, is actually set up email accounts for my kids when they were born. And I send them pretty regular emails, just like, here's a piece of art you made, or here's a funny dance that you did. In the last 11 months, those emails have taken on a pretty different tone. They're sort of a time capsule in a way, where I record the experiences of the world and the experiences of our family, and sort of try to express them to somebody who's 5 years old and 3 years old as they are. And it's funny because the emails are for them, but of course I have them in my sent folder and I read them all the time, and they actually remind me of this experience. And it's almost like keeping a diary in a certain way. And I hope that I can go back to those. I think that they'll be clarifying. I think that they'll provide a sense of perspective, because we are going to continue to go through stressors, but there will also continue to be so many things to be grateful for. And I think that in the post-pandemic years, I hope that we can try to be of more service to one another, honor our connections to one another, not get caught in hyper-individualism. But I hope that when we're going through our day-to-day stressors in that future, we can also say, well, at least I can be with my friends. At least I can, go to work. At least I can attend a concert. Imagine that, right? And how do we savor that future normalcy? Well, one way is to have a clear recollection of the past.
Well, Jamil, I hope you send us all these sent mail folders, so that we can look at them. And so I'm committing right now, in front of everyone here, that the next time we all get together, hopefully in Austin, where we could all get a drink, together, but hopefully that we will remember the fact that it wasn't as fun to do this over Zoom, and that we will really appreciate it even more deeply when things change around. But with that, I think it's a fantastic place to end. I hope you've learned a little bit something about how you can harness this sort of stressful time to feel a little bit better, and how empathy and controlling the chatter in your head can help with that. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Take care.